Hello, dear viewers. I'm George from Ireland, and I'm standing in front of the flat where Amy Johnson lived for the last few years of her life. So she was perhaps the United Kingdom's most celebrated aviatrix. So she's born in 1903 in Hull. That's the county town of the East Riding of Yorkshire, or Kingston upon Hull. But it's the River Humber flows through it, but they sometimes call that the Hull. Anyway, so she was from quite a distinguished family, her grandfather having mayor of the city. Her family were a prosperous fishmonger family. They had more like a firm of fishmongers, not just a stall. And she was one of three sisters. She's the eldest, so they had no brothers, so she's a bit of a tomboy. And she grew up during the First World War. And whilst there was the slogging match in the trenches, rather inglorious and no major breakthroughs really, but what was quite different was the fighting in the air, and that was something that was really being pioneered. The very first combat in the air, plane to plane, was in the First World War. Planes went up initially simply to reconnoitre enemy positions, land and report back, there being no radios in planes in those days. So these planes were very crude indeed. And a Frenchman, I can't remember his name, he stunned the world in 1912 by flying all the way from France to the UK. Yeah, that's right, 20 miles, they couldn't believe it. But anyway, people were willing to take risks in wartime, obviously. Governments were willing to fund aviation, so it came on leaps and bounds in just 4 years. So that really excited the public attention. It certainly caught her imagination. And so these combat pilots were called Knights of the Sky or Knights of the Air. And they became public heroes, just as lionized by the popular press in Central Powers countries, as well as in Allied countries, like the Red Baron von Richthofen, who was shot dead by an enterprising Australian infantryman in 1917, shot dead when he was up in the sky. Anyway, so Amy Johnson, she resolved to be a pilot. She was academically very able, mathematically gifted. She went to the University of Sheffield, also in Yorkshire, and now there's a building named in her honour there. So only about 2% of the population went to university in those days, and for women it was much lower than that. So she read economics, and despite having a degree, she had to work as a secretary to a solicitor. That's even though most solicitors didn't have degrees at the time, or very few did actually. It's only in the 90s it actually became compulsory for solicitors to hold a degree. Anyway, so she really wanted to get into flying. Now, a lot of families have been dead against this. There were quite strict gender roles. This was really breaching gender norms, but change was afoot. In the First World War, women had taken on roles that they traditionally hadn't performed. They had to fill these positions to allow men to go free for the army, because there was levée en masse for the first time in the United Kingdom with the Compulsory Military Service Act. Anyway, so women have been bus drivers, and they'd done all sorts of jobs that only men did up to them. 1919, the Sex Disqualification Removal Act was passed. Women could be admitted to the bar, could qualify as solicitors and accountants for the very first time. Although the medical profession actually allowed women to be physicians way back in the 1860s, so medicine was sort of 50 years ahead of law. Make of that what you will. Anyway, and so her parents were 100% behind her. Perhaps surprisingly, they're very broad-minded, and they were about 2 generations ahead of themselves in their mindset, because some would say it simply wouldn't do for a young lady to be a pilot, partly because the life expectancy was so short. Churchill was also an early enthusiast for flying, and he so often stacked the odds against himself, and one of his dear friends was killed in an air crash because safety route measures were very primitive indeed. Navigation was rudimentary, to say the least. They didn't do all these checks. We didn't have meteorological equipment. Really everything could go wrong because it was very much experimental, so rough and ready planes were in those days. The people were even skeptical about whether parachutes would work. Whether if you jumped out at 20,000 feet, were your lungs going to burst? Well, obviously that proved to be dead wrong. So there was sometimes almost a funeral atmosphere when somebody went for his or her first flight. But so soon she made that her main occupation and made money out of it, going around barnstorming. But she was the first woman to fly on her own from the United Kingdom to Australia, stopping many places along the way. Planes couldn't get that far without refueling back then. She and a man co-piloted a flight to Moscow from London, the first to do it in one day. 1,700 miles, it took 21 hours, obviously with a few pit stops. It takes 3.5 hours these days at most. So obviously planes are far faster. There were no jet engines back then. They used those rotor blades, obviously. So there were biplanes and triplanes. I don't know exactly what equipment she was on, you see. I know my pilot's terminology, but I don't know anything about aeronautical engineering. She flew all the way to Australia via India, which included Karachi, one of her pit stops, Allahabad, as in where Nehru's from. When she got to Australia, she flew all the way around. So she was front page news much of the time, and she was honoured by being allowed to meet the King Emperor George of that name, the Fifth. So she met a pilot of her own nationality, a Briton called Guy Mallinson. She obviously had an effect on him because he proposed to her within 8 hours of meeting. And so they were constantly united, not only on the ground but often in the air. Often they were pilot and co-pilot to each other. So I don't know who held the joystick in that relationship, but they were never blessed with the pitter-patter of little feet. So the Second World War came around, and the RAF would not use women for combat. Social mores were against it. It seemed deeply wrong because gender roles were deeply ingrained. Now, the Soviets didn't have quite such hang-ups, and they did use women in combat roles. But she could be a transport pilot, so she's in the Royal Air Transport Auxiliary, so flying supplies around. I'm not sure possibly flying men around because there was a shortage of trained pilots. Here she was a very experienced and seasoned pilot. She'd even qualified as a ground engineer for aircraft way back in the 1920s, the first woman to do so. So in 1941 she was flying over the Thames estuary near Kent when she vanished. Quite what happened we don't know. Did she crash by accident? She might have been shot down by an enemy pilot. More likely, it's thought that she might have been shot down by friendly fire, blue on blue, that her plane was perhaps mistaken for a Luftwaffe bomber and brought to grief. But her mortal remains have never been recovered, which is why this blue plaque here in Finchley, London, is all the more important. So she's an inspirational figure to a generation of women, and not just those who wanted to be aviatrixes like her. So anyway, because we were not too far from one of the RAF bases up here in Finchley. There was RAF Uxbridge. There were other ones since closed down. On that bit of road to Oxford, you can see that main one. I don't know why on earth the name escapes me now. I've forgotten it so many, passed it so many times. All right, so I hope you're enjoying my channel. So please subscribe, and make sure you ask others to subscribe too. I urgently need donations to keep my channel going. So kindly donate with the greatest liberality to me on PayPal. It's georgecallahan799@gmail.com. Callahan spelled C-A-A-A-G-H-A-N. Now, I've got to keep this video going for just over 8 minutes because then I can monetize it. So yeah, anyway, keep those pounds, shillings, pence, and greenbacks rolling in. No donation is too large. I remember I teach people online in history, politics, religious studies, English language, English literature, English foreign language, law, French, maths and science, if you're not too high level. Toodaloo.